Back in my mid to late 20s, I worked a job as a security guard at a Kmart supercenter in Iowa City, Iowa. Most of you probably never heard of Kmart before, but to put it in simple terms, just imagine a cheaper Walmart/Target. Business was booming back in the early 2000s, and nowadays a lot of Kmarts ended up closing down. My job was to keep watch of one that was currently in the process of relocating. It was a chill job, although a bit boring as you'd be the only one in the store with nothing to do. This never really bothered me, as I'd always find myself playing games on my phone or texting a friend to pass time. Well, one day I had been scheduled to work a double, meaning I'd be working both the day and night shift. The reason for this was because the other security guard who did the night shifts quit on the spot and went to go make a living in real estate. Because apparently this guy obviously never heard of a 2 weeks notice before, and they scheduled me until they could find another person. This got on my nerves pretty easily, and sitting in the dark making $14 an hour didn't help. That being said, I really didn't have a choice and bit my lip and agreed to work a double. Throughout the day, things went well for the most part, watching the movers relocate the shelves, equipment, etc. 7 p.m. comes around, and I prepare myself for a long 10-hour night shift. Being all alone in an empty store with no light, but a little office in the back, is scary enough. Now let's fast forward till around 1 a.m. I'm sitting on my chair by the front when I hear one of the radios turn on in the back office. It's not uncommon for them to go off once in a while, as they tend to pick up a signal from someone else on the same channel. Not thinking anything of it, I tense on my phone when I hear it go off again, this time with a much stronger signal. At that point, I get up and walk toward the back office when I hear this low, grainy voice say, "I can see you." My heart sank into the pit of my stomach as I heard him say this, and it was then where I asked who it was. After getting no response, I glance over to the back exit of the store, and due to the glow of the red exit sign, I was able to make out the silhouette of a person. However, for some reason, I don't think they saw me, and I played dumb by looking the other way and turning off all of the radios. I wasn't just gonna go back to my post with someone possibly dangerous in the building with me, so I did the only thing I could do. Right then, I turn around and start booking it toward the front entrance as I heard whoever it was trying to catch up. Thankfully, I made it out the door, locking it behind me. A few seconds later, I see this tall man dressed in all black run up to the front and put his hands on the window. He was not a pleasant-looking man. His eyes were wild, and his grin was menacing. At that point, I called the police, where they thankfully arrived in a few minutes, where they went inside the building. However, like in most situations like this, whoever was inside the store with me was gone. Police concluded that they had simply left through the emergency exit. Needless to say, I continued my shift while a patrol car stayed in front just in case whoever it was came back. Till this day, I still can't get that man's face out of my head. It's just something you can't unsee. I stayed at the job for a month later before landing a new one that paid more and didn't require night shifts. I've never seen or heard from that man again, and I really hope it stays that way. While all of this was indeed a scary situation, one question still comes up that I can't seem to figure out the answer to. The store had several cameras that had night vision, and not one of them picked up the man by the exit, even though they were pointed at it. The police and I reviewed the footage and saw no one in the store other than me. That was the reason as to what made me so scared, and it's also the reason why I will never work another night shift again. This took place in 2012 at a 7-Eleven gas station when I was a junior in college. I had attended a community college in New York, not the city, just the state itself. The reason I chose the school was to make it easier for me to transfer to the university I originally wanted. However, every college student knows that college isn't free and can definitely leave you with a large debt in your bank account. I received federal aid from the state, but there was still a lot of tuition that I had to pay for. Because of this, I ended up getting a full-time job at a 7-Eleven working as a gas station attendant. It wasn't the best paying job, but it paid enough to help me get by while also paying off school. I'd done tons of under-the-table stuff like a bouncer, a cleaner at bars, but I was really surprised that I was working this hard. For reference, I'm a male, and I was 20 at the time of the story. I had mostly worked night shifts, which I didn't mind doing as these were the shifts where you'd commonly have to deal with fewer people. 10 p.m. was around the time where you'd stop getting customers, and traffic would start to die down. Anything past 10 p.m. was your occasional customers coming in for a late-night snack or something. I had seen my shifts go relatively well until a night where I had to cover for someone who called in sick. It was annoying, to say the least, but I realized it's a bigger paycheck at the end of the day. When working the night shift, we had to go ahead and shut the front door, turn off all of the lights, and operate from the window box. It was a quiet night with little to no cars on the road, and I had just gotten done wiping the counter. With nothing to do, I go behind the counter and decide to play some Sudoku, which passed the time. When I look out the window, I saw a man by the gas pumps. He looked somewhat normal, although a bit lanky, and seemed to have taken an interest in the gas pumps for some reason. He wore a black long-sleeve shirt, cargo pants, and out of all things, was carrying an empty Macy's bag. He casually walked around the pumps as if he were inspecting them. I wasn't sure what he was doing, but I kept a close eye on him. It also came to my attention that this man didn't have a car, nor did he arrive in one. It was almost as if he just walked up to the gas station. After all, this was located in an area that was notorious for druggies and meth heads, so I guess it wasn't all that uncommon. About a minute later, he proceeds to walk up to the window and says he needs pump 3. He throws his card into the box thing, and I pull it in. Our practice for this was that if they gave us their card, we'd let them pump as much gas as they wanted and swipe their card afterwards. We try to go above and beyond for our customers, but the policy sort of changed for obvious reasons. I then see him walk toward pump 3, confused as to what he was doing since I didn't see a car. What I saw him do next is something that shook me to the bone, where all I could do was just watch. He proceeds to take the gas pump and begins to pour all of the gasoline on the actual pump itself while making this insane laugh. At this point, I hit this little pager we have under the desk that alerts the police in case of a fire or robbery. 20-year-old me sees this man take out a lighter and attempts to ignite it. By some stupid luck, the lighter isn't working, and I'm crouched down by the counter, praying the police make it in time before this place goes up in flames. These pumps are extremely flammable, and I knew that if he had managed to light it, that it would have been over. The more he tried to light the lighter, the more irritated he became, and that was when I hear the sound of police sirens approaching. They get out of their patrol cars and tase him on the spot before he could start up the lighter. I come running out of the gas station, nearly crying, knowing that if they had arrived any later, I'd probably be dead. Both police and the fire department arrived on the scene, where they were thankfully able to remove the gas. At that point, I fall to my knees, bawling my eyes out as my body hit the concrete of the gas station. I was comforted by police and was taken to a hospital to check if I was exposed to any hazardous chemicals. I obviously ended work early that night, but still got paid for what I was owed. A week later, I got laid off from 7-Eleven, but ended up getting a huge severance package to pay for school. I ended up getting a new job shortly after that, after my previous employer wrote a glowing recommendation letter for me. While something good did happen, this also had a major impact on my mental health, as I had to get years of therapy. It's been 10 years now, and this incident is still brought up by my parents from time to time. I'm now in my early 30s and have a lovely wife, and have moved past it. I urge anyone reading this to cherish the time you have, as you don't know what will be your last day. Had that man managed to spark that lighter, I wouldn't be writing this right now. The whole gas station would have exploded, and that's exactly what I thought was gonna happen. I still don't know what his intentions were or why he did what he did. But to be honest, I don't want to know. I'd like to think that he was on something, but maybe that's just because I'd rather not think of the alternative. I still think about how it would have turned out had the police arrived even a minute later. Story 2. A little over a year ago, I had a job working overnight at a gas station close to my house. I'm a woman and was 31 at the time. I know to some it seems unsafe for a woman to work graveyard shift by herself. However, it was a slow store, and the sheriff's office was about 20 feet across from it. I really didn't think I would have that many problems. There would be about 30 customers in an 8-hour shift, and that was all. No busier nights. It was about 3:30 in the morning. I went outside to sweep the parking lots and last minute checked the trash. It was time for a cigarette, and I had one headphone in, kind of jamming out. Across the road in the parking lot of the sheriff's office, I saw a figure with his back to me. He was swaying back and forth while looking down. Honestly, it looked like he was enjoying a much-needed piss against the sheriff's office. Though yeah, the building closes at 4:00 p.m. and doesn't open again until 6:00 in the morning, but why? By the back of his ripped white t-shirts, I remember that he had come in about 4 hours earlier. He was a total creep, and I could already tell he had a good buzz going. I didn't say anything. I just took my eyes off of him and tried not to draw attention to myself. It was working until a car pulled in. I was still outside as they pulled up. I saw him look at the car, and then at me and back and forth again. As the customer is leaving, I walked her outside. I still had half a smoke burning and had left my dustpan outside with a squeegee. We both heard him start to swear angrily and seemingly engage in an argument with himself. She looked across the road and told me to be careful. I made an awkward joke about him being the one who should be afraid of me or something like that. The man was still there but closer to the road now, facing the parking lot of my store. Whatever he's yelling was completely unintelligible. He was obviously very drunk and could barely stand upright, still swaying away. I didn't engage him, but I didn't take my eyes off of him this time. I just slowly walked back into the store. Something about his face really bothered me. It was dark outside, but his eyes looked wild. My experience during graveyard jobs has been that the crazy-eyed ones are the worst ones. I didn't like it at all, and wanted no part of it. I still had almost 3 hours to go and 2 before any other employee got there. Instantly, I went to the computer and typed up a temporarily closed sign just in case he wanted trouble. I was coming around the corner on my way to the doors when I saw that he walked across the road to my side. Now I literally just barely got the second door locked when he stumbled into our very small parking lot. My hand makes the mind hand signal for cuts across my neck, basically saying, "Nope, sorry, you can't come in here. We're closed." I shook my head back and forth in hopes to further discourage him. He started walking away but screamed something at me while he's walking. I don't mean he was grumpy and shouted at me or yelled that I was creature or anything. I mean like he was at an enraged volume and was violently throwing his hands everywhere, definitely knowing I'm in the wrong shift of the wrong job. I got really skeeved out. I decided to call the cops. It's a good thing too, because the minute I hung up with them, there he comes again up to the door. He starts pulling and banging on it. He backs up and runs into it trying to ram it. It's not that it would have done any good. I made the mistake of telling him that I had called the cops and his ass was about to be grass. I say I made the mistake of telling him because once I said that, he took off. The police never found him. They drove around the road and surrounding neighborhoods for over an hour but found no one. He was on foot, so I don't get where he could have gone to. He didn't harm me. And with them not finding him, I didn't fill out a police report or anything. I was safe behind thick glass doors that were locked for the rest of my shift. It just sucked. Maybe if I didn't warn him ahead of time, I wouldn't have had to spend the last 3 months of my job constantly looking over my shoulder. I'll never know what the right choice was. I'm just glad I don't work there anymore. Story 3. Being a delivery driver was never my first choice for a gig in my late 20s, but I got laid off during CO, and the only place hiring was a local pizza shop. It was a popular place in our town, but really, it was just basic pizza. Anyway, this was during the time when everyone was staying inside and ordering for delivery, so I was working overtime and staying busy up until close every night. At 1:00 a.m., this was just another day running to addresses all over town. Around 12, we got a call in for 4 large pizzas for a house located just outside of town, about 30 minutes away. I accepted it, knowing it would be my last order anyway. And it was a big order, so the payment would likely make up for the longer drive. By 12:15, I got en route to the house. The drive wasn't anything to note. All the roads were empty, and nobody was outside due to the mandatory lockdowns going on. When I got to the address, though, I was immediately confused. There was a driveway with a large open gate, looking like it belonged to a large mansion of some kind, but at the end of the driveway was nothing. It was just a dead end with forest all around. Except not far off in the trees was a glowing light. I pulled in and parked in the middle of the driveway and got out. Now, standing outside, I could see more clearly that it was a campfire or bonfire of some kind, and I could hear a group of people talking. After a moment, a figure stepped in front of the glowing light from the fire and waved at me, like he was inviting me to bring over the pizzas. It goes without saying that this was not normal in any way, but seeing them wave me over and hearing the group of people gave me more than enough reason to believe it was just a bunch of college kids hanging out. I mean, they did order 4 large pizzas, so it all just added up in my head. I got the pizzas from the back seat and left the headlights on as I started walking off the driveway and into the trees. A few more people showed up in the light as I got closer, all watching me walk toward them. When I reached the bonfire, there was half a dozen more people standing and sitting in the area. Strangely, none of them seemed happy that the pizza was here, and there was nothing else around in the yard. No beer bottles or drinks of any kind. No music players, no games. Just a bunch of people hanging around the bonfire. I stood on the edge of the site and kind of just held the pizzas up awkwardly, hoping one of them would come up to take them and pay. A second later, a man walked over and took the boxes, handing them off to someone else. The whole eerie feeling of this place was getting to me, making me more uncomfortable with every second that passed. Before I could even ask for payment, though, I heard some footsteps approaching, and from the forest, several more people came in toward the bonfire. There were at least a dozen of them now, all looking at me and not saying anything. I'd never once left without payment, but this situation literally had me shaking. I quickly turned around and started walking back to my car. I looked back a couple of times, seeing them still standing by the fire and not hearing any of them speaking. As I exited the tree line, though, my heart almost stopped as 2 figures sprinted away from behind my car. They went straight into the forest and disappeared past the headlights. I didn't even check my car for anything missing. I just got in and backed out, speeding down the road to get as far from there as possible. Once I made it back to the shop, I told my manager of the strange situation. Thankfully, he understood and even tried calling the number they used to place the order, but they declined to answer. After a bit of discussion, I ended up calling the police to have them check up on the group's suspicious behavior. It had been less than an hour since I was there, but when the police arrived, the only sign of them was the bonfire still burning but left unattended. What really happened that night is unknown, and as far as I can see, It will likely remain that way. Story 4. I used to work as a security guard for a small warehouse in my city. It was an overnight job, which wasn't ideal, but it paid really well in comparison to other similar gigs. Though the warehouse itself wasn't too big or impressive, the company that owned it sold expensive tech items. So I guess it was necessary to have the building under surveillance 24/7. My job was nothing more than watching the cameras, walking around, and very rarely filling out reports. This night, it was raining heavily with occasional thunder as well. Honestly, although it was a bit of a creepy ambience, it was nights like these that I felt more laid back, knowing that nobody would be going out. I got in and talked to the closing shift workers as they left, having the warehouse to myself from 10:30 p.m. to 6:00 a.m. Usually, the building was really quiet with only a bit of creaking, but with the rain crackling down on the roof, it was almost impossible to hear anything else. About 2 hours in, I took a break from staring at the camera footage and got up to walk around the building for a typical security check. I went all the way down to the far end where most of the actual storage section of the warehouse was, then started walking to the other end. But a soft beeping sound began echoing through the hallway. It was an alert coming from the security room. I walked quickly over and checked it, seeing that it was a latch sensor on the back door, which meant that someone tried to open it. I opened up the live camera feed that covered that door, but nobody was out there. After a minute, I went to the back door myself to take a look at it, thinking maybe the sensor was faulty or that the rain had messed with something. I disabled the alarm and opened the door, then glanced around, seeing nothing but an empty alleyway behind the warehouse. Nothing out of the ordinary. The door itself looked fine, though I was no expert on it. But I ran it through the test, and it never misfired or failed to detect the latch. I looked around once more before shutting and locking it. Unfortunately, despite me not seeing anyone or anything, I still had to file an entire report on the incident due to the alarm showing up in the system. So I got back to the security office and started filling out the paperwork. Only a couple of minutes in, a thud echoed through the entire building. I jumped up and stared down the hallway, unsure of exactly where the sound came from or what it was. I left the room and stood in the hallway, listening for any more sounds, but didn't hear anything aside from the rain hitting the roof. I walked cautiously across the building, looking at the shelves for any fallen boxes or noticeable damage. But as I got closer to the front of the building, the sound of the rain started to get louder. I rounded the corner and stopped in place as I looked across the warehouse. The front door was wide open, and on the floor, I could see the reflection of water puddles, likely from someone having entered the building. I sprinted back and locked myself inside the room, pressing the emergency button to get a hold of the police immediately. While I waited, I heard a few thuds from within the building, and then it stayed quiet until the police arrived. I waited by the front and gave a report to one of the officers while 2 others searched the warehouse. A minute later, they came back to the front with a man in cuffs. They said he was hiding behind some boxes in the storage area with a hammer in his hands, and as he passed by, he gave me a cold stare that horrified me. After a few days, the police reported back that the guy seemed to have been under the high influence of several drugs and gave no reason for his actions. It's unclear what he intended to do, but he was hiding with a hammer in his hands after forcefully breaking in. And with him being so intoxicated, there's just no saying what he could have done. Luckily, he's still behind bars, and I no longer work overnight at a creepy warehouse. But that night still holds a horrifying feeling over me, especially on rainy nights when I can't see or hear my surroundings. Story 5. I'm an officer for our local police department. Shifts in our department are always shifting around, having people work 10 to 12 hours on a different schedule every week. Sometimes overnight followed by early morning, and then overnight again. On this particular day, I was working 10 p.m., to 10 a.m. and was at the office when a dispatcher notified me of a call about a group of teenagers trespassing on private property. Specifically, it was an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town that had been deserted for the last decade. This was a common hangout spot for groups to engage in various illegal activities, and the whole department knew about this place. Most of us had been there several times before. This was my fourth time responding to a call there, and I expected it would be a quick and typical case of walking in and either escorting a group of friends out or watching them run off. I was tired, so either scenario was fine with me. I honestly didn't care too much to arrest and charge them. I just needed them to leave the property. When I arrived, I quickly noticed a flashlight shining through the windows of the second story. What was strange was that it was moving really fast across multiple windows, like someone was running through the hallway. I got out of my vehicle and prepared my flashlight, then entered the building. The first thing I did was call out, requesting everyone to show themselves, but of course, no one did. I listened at the entrance for any noises to hopefully give me an idea of where to look, but it was dead silent, which actually woke me up and got my nerves going, having me keep my right hand on the holster of my gun. I think there was always a slight fear that it could be a trap to lure in an officer and attempt something, but I kept my cool and walked through the old hallway and up the flight of stairs. It was as I reached the top that a loud thud echoed through the building. It sounded like someone hitting a wall, and was definitely from the second floor. I entered the hallway and shined my flashlight all the way down, not seeing anyone or even a sign of anyone. I called out again, very aggressively, knowing that the stairs I was by were the only way up and down from the second story. I stayed there and listened again, but heard nothing more than the creaking of the building. I walked slowly through the hallway, looking through each door and scanning the rooms with my flashlight. But there was nothing more than old hospital beds and graffiti. When I got to the last room, the door was closed, so I called out one more time before swinging it open. I cleared the room, but nobody was inside. However, there were signs of recent activity, being cigarettes on the ground with smoke still rising from them. This was extremely concerning, knowing that they hadn't left the second floor through the stairs, and the only other way out was if they had jumped out a broken window. Before I could even check, the door behind me slammed shut, followed by something smashing against it and footsteps departing down the hallway. Luckily, I was able to forcefully push the door open enough to slide through the opening, seeing that a large hospital bed had been pushed against it. By the time I got out, whoever was there had long gone. Backup arrived, and we did a more thorough investigation, also checking in with the person who originally called in about the two teenagers. What was odd was that there was only one clear set of footsteps I had heard, and only one flashlight seen in the window. The cigarettes still burning also showed that they had left in a hurry, which could have been from me arriving. But then why would one of them have stayed behind? In the morning, we got a report from a mother about her missing teenage son, followed soon after by an identical report from another mother about her teenage son. After looking into it for days, then weeks, then months, it became almost definite that they were not going to show up. And now 6 years later, they still haven't. Their disappearance is an unlikely one, and that's what makes it so difficult. It isn't certain whether the person in the hospital with me was one of the two kids, but the current most stable theory is that it was someone else. Unless something more comes up, it's not likely that we will ever know for sure. Story 6. I picked up my first job this year as a delivery driver for Pizza Hut. I'm 16, so this was only a part-time job that I did after school a couple of days a week. I chose Pizza Hut, though, because it's not that busy nowadays, and I didn't want to have a job I was stressing out all the time. At first, months passed with nothing of interest. It was a very boring and repetitive job that left most days as forgettable. But then I had one experience that I'll never forget. It was a Friday. and we got an order in just before closing. The address wasn't too far, but it went through a part of town that I almost never went to. This neighborhood was different from the rest, not having tons of houses or stores in it, which gave me no reason to ever go there. While driving through, I kept checking the GPS as it took me all the way through the neighborhood, turning down seemingly every road until it finally said I arrived. But something was off. On my left was a row of maybe 6 or 7 houses, and on the right was a path leading to a park. The waypoint on the GPS was showing up on the right side, so I double-checked by searching the address on Google, and it was the actual address of the park. I parked on the side of the road and picked up the pizza, getting out and walking up to the path. With a better look, I could see that it was just a walking path, not leading to any sort of playground or anything, which is where I expected to see a group of kids that had ordered a pizza. But instead, there was a guy sitting on a bench a little ways down, waving at me. I started walking over, still a bit unsure about it. As I got closer, he stood up and started sifting through his wallet for cash. The fact that he was alone on a walking path at night, and for some reason needed a pizza delivered here, was odd to say the least, so I was skeptical. When I went up and greeted him, we began exchanging everything, but during the interaction, the guy started talking to himself, repeating the same phrases like, "I'm okay," and "everything's going to be okay," which made me feel like I kind of needed to ask him if he was okay. He stopped talking and looked up at me. In his eyes, I saw fear and helplessness, something that I don't think I'd ever truly seen in someone's look before. From his look alone, a surge of adrenaline rushed through me, and I turned around, only to be met by a tall man wearing a cloth mask over his face. He held me at knife point and screamed at me to empty my pockets and toss everything on the ground. I quickly did as he said and only became more terrified when he started to forcefully push both me and the guy from the bench off the path and into the woods, leaving everything on the ground and showing no interest in any of it. We walked for a few minutes, going well into the woods, far enough to no longer see the light of the path. Then the guy next to me suddenly shoved me to the ground and started to run in the other direction. The man in the mask surprisingly left me alone and took off after him. I quickly got back up and ran back to the path, hearing and seeing nothing else. Police arrived only a few minutes after I called, but both men were gone, and from what I know, they still are. I can't say why the other victim pushed me down, though it was most likely an effort to leave me behind so he could escape. I don't blame him, but it was a low move and makes me feel slightly less sorry for him, and whatever he had to endure afterward. What the abductor intended to do is unknown, but him showing no interest in my wallet or belongings makes me feel it was something extremely awful. Ironically, though, it was the selfishness of the other victim that both put me in that awful situation and saved me from it. Story 7. In my mid-20s, I worked at a retail store as the overnight manager. It wasn't a big place, and the only reason I was technically a manager was that I'd be the only overnight worker, so I was in charge of checking stock, filling shelves, and sometimes receiving order shipments. I was very satisfied with the job and never found myself hating the work. Up until this, I hadn't had anything really happen. It was a weekday night, and a storm was just setting in as I started my shift. Over the first hour of being there, the rain had picked up, and the wind was hitting the building much harder than before, making a lot of noise. I was filling the shelves for the first 2 hours, trying to get the time-consuming tasks out of the way first. As I was in the aisle, though, I heard a thud sound resonating through the building. It sounded like it came from the back of the store in the warehouse section, where our delivery bay was. I walked over and saw the solid metal back door that truck drivers used to get in when making deliveries. The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that the thud sounded like a bang at this door. as if a driver was trying to make a delivery, but there were none scheduled for tonight. I opened the door and was met with a face full of cold rain and wind. I stuck my head out briefly to look down at the shipping bay and saw no trucks, so I closed the door and dried off while walking back to the aisles. I assumed the noise was just the building having shifted a bit from the wind, or maybe just some strange sounding thunder that I hadn't noticed before. I continued working for another full hour before taking a lunch break in the back office, spending maybe 15 minutes there before heading back. But while I was walking through the store, I got this strange feeling like everything had gone silent aside from the rain ticking on the roof. It gave me chills, and as I reached the end of the aisle, I saw something that made my heart almost stop. Right next to my cart, halfway down, was a line of wet shoe prints through the aisle. I approached it without even thinking and tried to figure out how this was even possible. I followed them down to the front of the store until I saw so many watery prints going all over that it was impossible to follow, and honestly horrifying to know that they'd walked around the entire place. I ran back to the office and locked myself inside, calling the police and waiting. As I sat there, I only got more scared as I couldn't see outside the office door, and the rain pouring on the building was too loud for me to hear anything else. After 10 minutes, the operator that had me on hold came back on the phone and said the police were right outside the building. I quickly got up and opened the door, and right on the ground was another set of watery shoe prints alongside mine, leading right up to the office I was in. I sprinted to the front and hurried to let the police in. In their search, they didn't find anyone in the store. Security tapes were reviewed not long after, showing us a man in a dark jacket entering the building through a side door that had been left unlocked. He clearly spotted me early on and stayed hidden until I went on break. Then he walked around aimlessly. He didn't steal or break anything. He just went down the aisles and looked at the shelves. But the creepiest and most horrifying part was when I entered the office and waited for the police. The man came up to and stood outside the office door, waiting for several minutes as he stared at the doorknob, like he was preparing for me to come out. Luckily, he decided to walk away a few minutes later and exited the store. No more footage of him was seen after that. The man never came back, and as far as I was told, he was never found. What he was doing that night is still uncertain, and it will likely remain as an eerie uncertainty for the rest of my life. Story 8. I used to work the night shift as a pharmacy technician, and I can tell you that it's usually a quiet and uneventful job. Most nights, I fill prescriptions, restock shelves, and maybe help a few customers who couldn't sleep and decided to pick up their medication in the middle of the night. But one night, something happened that still sends shivers down my spine. It was a rainy and cold night, and I had just finished refilling the pill dispensers when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be a doctor calling in a prescription or a nurse with a question about a medication. But the voice on the other end was neither of those. "Hello," the voice said, and it sounded shaky and anxious. "I need your help, please. You have to listen." I asked what was wrong, and the person on the line began to explain that they were in excruciating pain. They described their symptoms in detail, and it was clear that they were in distress. They begged for advice on what to take or do to alleviate the pain. I explained that I couldn't diagnose over the phone, and that they should consider calling 911 or visiting the nearest emergency room. But they refused, saying they couldn't leave their house, which was miles away from the hospital. As the conversation continued, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. The person's descriptions of their pain were becoming more and more extreme, and their voice seemed to change, becoming almost inhuman. It was as if they were trying to mimic human suffering, but failing miserably. I glanced at the clock and realized it was close to 3:00 a.m. I was alone in the pharmacy, and the feeling of isolation added to my discomfort. I tried to stay calm and professional, but the person on the other end of the line was relentless, insisting that I help them. They started to make strange, disjointed statements. They claimed that they knew where I lived, that they were watching me, and that they could see me right at that moment. Panic surged through me, and I hung up the phone, my heart pounding. I tried to shake off the unsettling call, convincing myself that it was just a prank or a disturbed individual seeking attention. But as I turned to go back to my work, I froze in my tracks. A chill ran down my spine as I saw a figure standing outside the pharmacy window. It was dark outside, but the figure was illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. They were wearing tattered clothes, and their face was obscured by a hood. My mind raced as I realized that this person matched the description the caller had given earlier. I fumbled to call the police, all the while keeping an eye on the figure outside. But as I looked away for just a moment to dial 911, they disappeared into the night. The police arrived soon after, but there was no sign of the mysterious figure. They took a report and assured me that they would patrol the area. I went home that morning, shaken and unable to shake the feeling of being watched. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but wonder if the unsettling call and the appearance of the hooded figure were connected. I tried to put it behind me and continue with my job, but the fear lingered. I never received another call from that person, and I never saw the hooded figure again. But the memory of that night and the chilling encounter still haunts me. I'll never know who they were or what their intentions were, but I can't help but feel that I narrowly escaped something truly terrifying that night. Story 9. I got a job as a police officer a few months ago for my first year or so, and expected to work the overnight shifts and do 3 12-hour shifts a week. It's totally brutal, especially given that the worst things happen at night. It's only my 3rd month on the job, and I already have a nightmarish story to tell. I was patrolling around my designated route at 2 or 3 in the morning. Absolutely no cars to be seen on the road at all. Most of my route was dark, since there was a lot of forest in our town, and then there would be one long street called Warren Street, one of the only streets lit up by streetlights out here. All the stores at this hour were closed, of course, so there was very little going on at this time. I took the left turn off a quieter road onto Warren Street, drove slow, always looking on both sides of the road to see if anything was going on in any of the parking lots. I picked up on something strange as my car zoomed past a coffee shop parking lot. I brought the car to a halt with a heavy stomp on the brakes and reversed until I got back to the parking lot. I rolled down my window and stuck my head out to confirm my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The lights in the coffee shop were on, which was beyond bizarre. The shop always closed at 6:00 p.m. on weekdays. I knew because I was a frequent there, and I knew the owner personally. I pulled up to the curb and figured I'd go check the door. Lo and behold, the door was unlocked. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped into the shop, calling the owner's name. Something about my voice echoing into an empty coffee shop at 3:00 in the morning was freaky as hell. It gave me shivers just wondering why the lights were on. I kept calling the owner's name until I heard a sound come from the basement. I didn't even know there was a basement until that day. I found a door that led downstairs to a dark abyss. I holstered the flashlight on my belt and aimed it down the stairs. I knew deep down it was my job to go down there and investigate, even though I was really afraid. There wasn't a light switch to be found, so I made my way to the bottom of the concrete stairs, not able to see much outside of the narrow beam of light that my cheap-ass police flashlight projected. I was at the bottom of the stairs now, looking around the pitch-black basement of the shop. Then there was the sound again, only this time much louder. It sounded like some kind of half-electronically produced and half-organically produced sound. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's really the best way I can describe it. It came from the back room. I stepped into that back room, which appeared to be an office of sorts. I just stood there waiting for the sound again. Might have stood there for 30 seconds until the same exact sound erupted from a corner of the room. It was a terrible, distorted kind of sound. It apparently came from inside an air vent in the corner. First thing I did was try to shine the light into the vent, but it didn't really work. The grill blocked any amount of light that would actually light up the inside of the vent. What I did next was put my ear up to the vent to try and listen for anything that could be inside. I heard something in there. I was 80% sure what I was hearing was the sound of someone breathing. My heart started racing even faster than it was 10 seconds ago. I tried one more time to see into the vent, this time angling the flashlight a little differently and pressing one eye up to the vent grill. I guess the light beam hit the grill of the vent at just the right angle because I saw the glove, and it was literally 4 inches from my face. I unholstered my gun as I shouted for the person in there to come out now, but as I tried the vent door, it seemed to be screwed on still. I could hear the person shimmying away through the vents until the sound was completely gone. Where did that vent lead to? How did they get in there? Why were they in there? What was that strange noise? So many questions that still remain unanswered. I called for backup, and we did a thorough investigation. We called the owner who came by to help us search the place at like 4 o'clock in the morning. There were no signs of breaking and entering anywhere. Not a single unscrewed vent, not a single broken window. Our investigation didn't last more than a few hours, after which we determined whoever was in the vents was gone. The thing that scares me the most is the sounds that I heard, not just the breathing from the vent, but that sound that was emitting from the vents, that sound that can be heard all the way from the upstairs of that shop. Story 10. I used to work at a gas station off some rural highway in Ohio. It was a 24-hour gas station. I usually worked from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. The shift always started busy. Lots of people on road trips coming in for coffee and snacks, filling up gas obviously, and usually around 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock, it would really quiet down. There would still be some people coming in, but once 1 or 2 a.m. hit, it was usually dead until the end of my shift. Usually, by that time, I was just playing games on my phone, doing work for my web classes, or watching movies on my laptop. The night in question, I was actually catching up on a TV show I was watching at the time. The road was completely dead at this hour. You could expect to see maybe 1 car pass by every 5 minutes, and maybe 1 car came into the lot every 20 minutes to a half hour. The headlights of a car suddenly glared through the window briefly as a car turned into the gas station lot and pulled up to one of the pumps. The car turned off and so did the lights. No one stepped out though. My attention went back to my show, and it did for a while. In fact, it took me a few minutes to realize that the car outside was still there, but no one ever came in to pay for gas, nor was there anyone standing outside filling up. The car was still just parked next to the pump. It was a bit sketchy, but then again, maybe they were texting, or on a call or counting money. There could be a number of reasons. Finally, I heard a car door shut outside. I paused my show, expecting them to come inside, but the guy just stood by his car. It looked like he was facing down at first, but when I squinted my eyes a little, I saw he was actually looking at me. He finally came over to the door and came inside. The bell of the door rang as some guy with his hood up walked right past the counter. He gave an ever so slight side glance to me. I could see just one of his eyes for a short second before he turned away and walked to the back section of the store by the snacks. I couldn't see or hear him while he was back there. He seemed to be back there for a while. I called out, "Do you need help, sir?" Not even the slightest sound in response. Just as I was about to come out from around the counter, the man came out from the corner and slowly walked back outside, not looking at me once. He went back to the pump, opened his passenger side door, and seemed to be digging in his car for something. Then he shut the door and looked at me again. Regardless of the distance and glass between us, I knew he was looking at me. He lifted his arms and seemed to begin waving me over. I didn't know what to do, but everything about the situation and this man were freaking me the hell out. He started walking very quickly over to the door, still waving his arms and hands at me. He put one hand in his pocket now while waving with the other still. It looked like he was reaching for something. I ran around from the counter to the door so I could lock it. I managed to with only 3 seconds to spare before he tried pulling it open. This was the first time I could see his face as he looked at me and I looked at him. I noticed his hand in his pocket, holding what I was sure was the handle of a blade. I shut the blinds to the windows as I told him were closed. He still stood there though. I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't because he started knocking on the glass. He knocked, and not just once, until it turned into more of a banging. I screamed a threat to call the cops if he didn't go away. He stopped a few moments after I said that, and I think he walked away. I didn't check. I simply stayed hidden in my corner behind the counter. I gave it 10 minutes before I would open the blinds back up. When I did, I felt a certain kind of horror in my body when I saw his car was still there. Where was he? Was he in his car or somewhere outside? Paranoid thoughts came to my head like, what if he was by the back door? I felt relieved when another car pulled into the parking lot and a normal-looking man came to the door. I unlocked it for him, and he came in with 2 20s in his hand. I told them to be careful of that other car. And then we got into a long conversation about what just happened. During the conversation, the other car turned on and finally drove off. The man and I both laughed about it, but when the guy who worked after me finally came in at 4 a.m., I was not laughing. My whole drive home, I was still shaking, thinking about what happened. Nothing that strange ever happened again throughout the rest of my time at that gas station. Story 11. I was driving a route to deliver the last pizza for the night. It was well into the early morning hours. Sometime around 2:00 a.m., I live in a pretty small town, working for a local pizza shop that was one of the only places offering delivery. Given that most of the town is spread far out, the road I was on was a not-so-often-used side road that conveniently went from one side of the town to the other without any stoplights or intersections. It was mainly empty, going through the forest that surrounded our town. As I drove along, something with my car started to feel different. I checked my gas, but it was at half and no other icons were showing up on my dashboard. I figured it was nothing and ignored it, but the further down the road I got, the more my car began to struggle. It was bumpy, shifting back and forth as I tried to maintain speed, until it just stopped accelerating. The car rolled forward, and I slowly turned it off to the side of the road, stopping it halfway in the grass. With some annoyance, I looked again at my dashboard as I tried to turn the car back on, but had no luck. I rubbed my eyes with frustration, then calmly got out and looked for any signs of damage on the outside of the car. I didn't see anything, but it was a really old car, and honestly, I didn't even know what to look for. As I was out there, I looked down the road, not seeing anything but fog and trees. But when I looked back the way I came from, I saw a figure far out, standing in the fog on the other side of the road. I got back in my car and called up one of my coworkers, who was also a friend of mine, and asked if he could do me a favor and pick me up. He agreed, though it wouldn't be for another 30 minutes. I thanked him, then called the customer to let them know my situation and apologize for the inconvenience. They were nice about it, so all I was left to do was sit back and wait. After a second, I remembered that figure that I'd seen, so I checked my mirrors, but saw nothing. I didn't see anybody on the side of the road or by the trees, although it was really dark and foggy. I sat back again and opened the box of pizza, grabbing a slice for myself while I waited. Over time, though, an eerie feeling continued to grow on me. Being out on this empty road with very limited vision just started to freak me out. I could only see a few feet into the forest before it was complete darkness, and the fog on the road seemed to only get more dense as time went on. I waited for 30 minutes, keeping my eyes open the whole time, and checking the mirrors. But then I heard something. Footsteps, getting more noticeable as the sound came closer, coming from the darkness within the forest. I stared at the empty fog, seeing a man appear near one of the trees. He walked directly up to my car, knocking on the window and sending a friendly smile at me. Sorry, I can't roll the window down," I said through the glass, not really sure what else to say. The man said nothing, but then casually tried to open the door before walking around to the back. I looked in the mirror as he stood by the trunk, seeming like he was trying to hide for a second, as he shifted around with something in his hands. And it was just then that headlights came through the fog from down the road. The man watched as the car slowed down and started to pull in behind me. Then he ran into the forest, losing my sight in the fog. My friend seemed to have noticed the man as well, because he was very cautious about approaching my car. We ended up leaving my car behind, and it was on the ride back with my friend that he told me the man was holding a gun before he ran into the forest. We called the police and had a tow truck pick up the car, which happened to have been broken into and looted. It turned out that the gas meter was stuck in the middle, and it was actually an empty tank. But concerning the man, there's been nothing on it. I don't know what he was trying to do. I mean, he obviously robbed the car, but what would he have done to me if he had tried to while I was inside? And why was he out there on that empty road in the middle of the night anyway? All I can say is that if my friend hadn't shown up when he did, I'm pretty sure I would have never been seen again. Story 12. I worked at a retail store in my 20s as an overnight lead. It wasn't one of your regular big chain grocery stores. It was a local place with only about 8 or 9 locations. Most nights, I'd have an overnight stalker to help out, but it wasn't uncommon for me to spend the whole shift alone. Again, not the biggest store, so it really wasn't a very intense working environment. A lot of the time, I'd find myself working slow just so I wouldn't run out of things to do. This was one of those nights where I was alone and working at a steady pace. At the beginning of my shift, I loaded up some boxes and moved into the aisles to start stocking. It doesn't take much mental effort, so my mind was elsewhere, just thinking about random things and not really paying any attention. I went through about 3 aisles until a knock at the front entrance made me jump. I almost didn't even realize what it was because I was so spaced out. But once I did, I got really confused. I heard them knock again, loud enough to echo through the store. I walked down to the end of the aisle and looked through the large front windows, seeing a man in a hood standing at the doors. I went up to the other side. "We're closed. Won't be open until 8 a.m., I said through the glass. The man looked at me but didn't say anything. I pointed at the sign on the door. "We're closed, sorry," I repeated. The man continued to look at me for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. I watched him walk until I couldn't see him anymore, but it didn't look like he had parked anywhere. The whole thing was odd, to say the least, but I figured he was just at the wrong place or something. I went back to what I was doing, stocking up the shelves, and eventually forgetting about the man. By 2 a.m., I'd gotten through half of the aisles and was ready to take my lunch break. I left the boxes where they were and went to the break room on the other end of the building. I was in there for probably a good half hour before I tossed the rest of my lunch and went back to work. I walked through the store and to the end of the aisle I was working on. But just as I looked up, there was a man walking past the other end. He looked like he was just walking across the store, not having noticed me. I froze in place, feeling that instant rush of fear. Now, listening intently, I could hear the man's footsteps move toward the side of the building I'd just come from. So I moved into the aisle and hid behind the shelves. The footsteps sounded like they went toward the break room. But just before I left the aisle to try and run and get help, I heard the man rushing out of the room. The footsteps were now sprinting through the store, getting closer and closer. I ran for the other end of the aisle, looking back and seeing the man turn in and start running at me. I ran for the front door, getting my keys out and trying to unlock it with shaky hands. The man appeared at the end of the aisle just as I got it open, and just as I stepped out of the building, I saw a bright flash in the corner of my eye and heard a pop sound that made my ears ring. A gunshot, so loud I didn't even know where it landed. But I sprinted for my life around the building. I made it to my car and hid in the back seat as I called 911. From what I know, the man didn't follow me outside. He was gone by the time police made it to the store. But they found the back door to be busted open, along with some heavy tools sitting next to it. The most terrifying of their findings was the hole created by the gunshot, sitting right to the side of the front doors. Why the man broke in and was so aggressive targeting me like that is unknown. From his behavior, the police seemed to think it was some kind of mental breakdown or psychotic break, not having any real reason to target me specifically other than the fact that I was alone. I no longer work there, but I can tell you that for the years following that incident, I was on edge every single. Story 13. Night. I work from home for a cybersecurity company, which really isn't as interesting as it might sound. I have to be online overnight from 10 o'clock to 6 o'clock, scrolling through files full of code to see if anything is a possible threat. It's extremely boring, and when paired with the overnight shift, it makes for a struggle every night to stay awake. One night, just a few weeks ago, I was up at 2 o'clock a.m. working and feeling the weight of my eyes. I pushed through the sleepiness for a while, checking my phone over and over, hoping the time had somehow skipped forward. At 2:40 though, I took a break and decided to order some food to get myself some fuel for the remaining 3 hours of my shift. I opened up Uber Eats, and my only real option was Taco Bell, so I sent in an order and got up to get something to drink. As I walked through the house with only the hallway light on, I woke up some more and realized it was raining outside. I looked out the front window and was surprised at how hard the rain was coming down, given I had been so oblivious to it while working. My first thought was how I just ordered for delivery, and I felt really bad for basically making someone run through the rain for my own convenience. I checked my phone and saw the order was already received, so I sat on the couch and waited for them to show up. After about 10 minutes, I was notified that they had picked up the order, so I watched the map on Uber Eats as the car made their way across town and eventually into my neighborhood. Once they were a minute away, I put my phone down and opened up the front door so we could make the exchange as quickly as possible. I stood at the open door, staring at the end of the road where they should have been coming from, but another 5 minutes went by without seeing any cars. I picked up my phone again and checked, but on the map, their car was still in my neighborhood, and when I zoomed in, I realized they were right around the corner, just before the turn onto my street. I looked outside again, but didn't see any lights from their car. My rightful reaction was that they probably had the wrong house or couldn't see the address numbers through the rain, so I tried calling them. After a few rings, they rejected it. I tried again, but had no luck. Unsure of what exactly was going on, I stayed at the door and waited. 5 more minutes went by before I tried to contact them again. I called, and this time it rang for a while, but then they answered. I asked where they were and if they needed help finding my house, but as I listened for their response, all I heard from their side was the crackling sound of rain pouring down. After another few seconds, I hung up, feeling really weird about that call. I checked the map one more time. At first, it hadn't updated, but when it did, it showed them right outside my house. I checked the windows and saw nothing, but knowing they were walking around in the rain like this was giving me a really bad gut feeling. I closed the door and locked it, and I swear I only made it a few steps down the hallway before a loud knock shook the front door. I carefully looked through the peephole. A man in a gray hoodie was pacing around on the porch, his head on a swivel like he was checking for any onlookers as he waited anxiously for me to answer. "Uber Eats delivery," he yelled, but nowhere did I see a bag with my food. I stayed in place, not answering or making any sounds. The man got increasingly more hectic with his movements and called out several more times. Then he suddenly pressed himself up against the door, blocking my view as I heard a few dull scrapes on the wood before he quickly ran to the side of my house and disappeared in the rain. I called the cops, but his car was already gone. From what I was told, he was using a scam account. A couple of days went by with nothing else to report on until I noticed a small scratch on my front door. It was an X, but it didn't look like it was made for me to see. It was more hidden, like a personal indicator for something. It could have just been a fluke to scare me, but I still painted over it to conceal whatever that marking was supposed to mean. That night still leaves me with an uneasy feeling in my gut, especially since he had some sort of sharp object in his hand as he waited for me to open the door. Part of me is still convinced that won't be my last encounter with him. Story 14. This happened last fall. It was toward the end of the season, closer to winter, and where I live, it gets pretty cold and even snows sometimes in October. I've been doing food delivery for the past 3 years and was working on this night. It was around 10 p.m. and lightly snowing outside. It was one of the first snowfalls, so people must have been skittish to go out. I was one of the few cars driving around, but a lot of orders were coming in. Pretty much as soon as I'd finish one, another one would pop up. After driving around everywhere until almost 1:00 a.m., I took up one last order. The snow was starting to pick up, and I was just getting a little tired. I drove through the McDonald's that they'd ordered from and picked up the food, then set in the directions to the house. It was close, about 10 minutes away, but I didn't consider the direction it was in before accepting the order. It was opposite from where I lived, and I was already a good 25 minutes from home, so it was going to be a long drive home afterward. Annoyed at myself, I turned out of the parking lot and onto the road. The plow trucks still weren't out yet, probably because they weren't expecting this much downfall, but my SUV was usually good in the snow, so I wasn't that nervous. While I was driving, I noticed the road I was heading down was about to leave the main area of town. I checked the map again, and it said it was this way, but it was just a very unusual route. I didn't even know any houses were down there, because the only reason people take the road is to get to the highway that leads out of state. I went down for a few minutes, seeing only streetlights and trees, until I came up to the turn. It was a single small street leading off the road. I slowed down, being more careful since this street was smaller and had trees lined up right beside it, so sliding off would make a really terrible night. As I made my way down, I saw a few long driveways leading to faint lights in the trees far out before I reached the driveway I was to turn down. It looked like all the others. I slowly drove through the driveway until I made it to the house. It was medium-sized and older, completely covered in snow. Nothing looked too notable about it, really. The only interesting thing was that it was out here in the middle of some forest. I parked out front and got the bag, then started walking up to the door. The snow was thicker than I would have liked, soaking my shoes and even the lower legs of my pants. When I got up to the porch, I knocked and started to set the bag down, but almost immediately the door swung open. I looked up, seeing a large man in a winter jacket. His face was pale, like he'd just been outside in the cold. "Hi, I got your order right here," I said, holding the bag up. After a moment, the man stepped back and opened the door wider. "You can set it down right over there," he said, lifting his arm and pointing toward what I assume was the kitchen. The way he said it made me feel like I had to. but I knew it was a horrible idea to go in there. I looked at the man's hands, seeing he wasn't holding anything, so it really didn't make any sense for me to do anything other than hand him the bag. "Sorry, but I really have to get going," I said nervously, holding the bag up again. The man's face dropped into a frown, then he suddenly slammed the door shut, still holding the bag up and just a bit shocked by what was happening. I set it down on the porch and quickly started walking back to my car. But just as I got past the front yard, I heard something from behind me. I turned around, realizing it was from somewhere on the other side of the house. It could have been a back door or something, but it was too muffled to hear clearly. Getting creeped out, I walked quicker and got in my car. I switched it on, and right as I looked up, I saw the man coming around the side of his house and making his way quickly over to my car. He had something in his hands. It almost looked like rope, but there was something else that I wasn't able to make out. I suddenly felt my heartbeat spike and adrenaline take over my body. I started going in reverse, trying my hardest to go quick, while also not getting stuck in the snow. The man got close, probably just a few feet away before my car was able to grip the road and start picking up some speed. I backed up through the whole driveway, seeing the man eventually stop and watch, slowly fading into the dark as I backed up into the street. I don't know what he was doing. Honestly, the whole thing was just terrifying and confusing enough to make me not even want to think about it. I still do food deliveries, but I'm far more cautious, and most of the time, I don't even knock on the doors anymore. I just drop the food on the porch and leave. Had I stayed any longer that night, or had entered the house, who knows what would have happened to me. Story 15. I work at a 24-hour drive-through restaurant, and this had happened only a few weeks ago. I'm a crew manager, but for the most part, I just do the same things everyone else does, which is cook and take orders for overnight hours. We always have at least two people, one being a manager and the other usually being a cook. On this night, the cook had called in sick, and when I called the others to see if they could cover a shift, none of them said they could. So, by 12 a.m., I was the only worker there. Now, usually the restaurant doesn't get busy overnight, and more employees come in at 4 a.m., so it wasn't an entire shift alone. But it still meant that for 4 hours, I had to do everything myself. I left my headset on in case someone came to the drive-thru, then started working on the tasks I had for the night. I started by scraping and cleaning the stovetops, but a few minutes in, I was interrupted by a banging sound from the front of the restaurant. I walked down and looked over the counter, seeing a man standing at the front door and banging on it. Then he pressed his face against the glass and looked inside, scanning the whole room before his eyes set on me. I walked over to the door as he stared at me, and when I got closer, he backed up and waited, like he thought I was going to open it. I yelled through the glass that our dining area was closed and that he needed to use the drive-thru if he wanted to order something. He looked confused, so I yelled again that the doors were locked and he had to use the drive-thru. He showed no response that time, not giving me any idea whether he understood me or not. So I just turned around and walked back to the kitchen. I figured he'd have to get the hint at some point that the doors weren't opening. I continued working on the stovetops, spending at least 15 to 20 minutes on them. Throughout this time, I had gone once to check the front to see if the man had left, and from what I could see, he was gone. The whole parking lot was empty, and the man was not at the door. But it was a couple of minutes after finishing with the stoves that I got an alert from my headset that someone was in the drive-thru. I turned on my mic and asked for their order while walking to the window, but nobody said anything. When I got to the window, I immediately saw in the camera that there wasn't a car out there. I looked around the screen and didn't see any movement either, so I ignored it and started walking back. But as I got to the back room, I slowed to a stop when I thought I heard something. I stood in place and listened as footsteps slowly walked above me on the roof of the building. They were careful steps, not making much sound aside from the roof creaking. But I had no doubt that there was someone up there. I followed the sound of their steps with my stare, moving down the ceiling until I saw the ladder leading to the maintenance hatch. And that's when I realized what they were doing. I sprinted over to the ladder and started looking for some sort of lock to keep the hatch from opening. But I'd never even used it, so I had no clue how it worked or if it even locked. Then there was a loud creak from the ceiling directly above me, and a few thuds came from the outside of the hatch. A moment passed. Then the hatch creaked open slightly, and through the small gap, all I saw were a set of eyes staring back at me. I sprinted for the front of the building, hearing loud thuds from where the hatch was as I quickly unlocked the door and ran for my car. I called the police as I sat inside and frantically looked through the windows of the restaurant while on the phone. I saw a shadow moving by the front counter. Then a man appeared standing in the far back of the restaurant, but was looking in my direction. After a moment, he turned and disappeared behind the kitchen, leaving me in a panic until the police made it. They searched inside and outside, going on the roof as well, but the man had already run off. Nothing from the place was missing either. No equipment or money was taken. Nothing. He just broke in and left. I tried not to think about it too much, but it's hard not to come to the conclusion that he was there for me. Like I said, this happened pretty recently, so there's still not much of an update on it. Even with his face on the cameras, there's yet to be a confirmed identity. The owner of the building added a padlock to the inside of the hatch, though which should have been done before, but I guess it was just an inconvenience. I still worry about the man's intentions, and if he could be watching for me to be alone again, waiting to do whatever it was he tried. Story 16. Before I spend a lot of my spare nights doing deliveries for DoorDash, it's my way of getting extra money while also not needing to commit to a more strict second job. I started driving around 9:00 p.m. on this night and steadily took on some orders until 11:00 where it slowed down a bit. During this time, I just drove around the shopping center that had most of the fast food restaurants people often ordered from, and eventually, another order came through. It was a regular order to be delivered about 4 miles away. After getting the food, I started the directions to the address, and it was almost immediately apparent that it wasn't a house. I scrolled in on the map, which only showed streets and buildings, and the address it pointed to was along a street that had no buildings on it. It looked kind of like an empty plot of land. But the DoorDash map was never that great, so I just started driving and decided to at least check it out and maybe call the customer if there was an issue. I drove out, taking just under 20 minutes until I reached the street it was on. This street was very bare, no houses or crossroads, and no cars driving on it. When I got to the end, it became a gravel road, and on the side was a small wooden sign that was too weathered to be legible. I pulled onto the gravel and turned my brights on, and right away I could see something far off down the road. I drove in closer, and as I approached it, my phone dinged to let me know that I'd arrived. In my headlights was a small mobile home, or some kind of RV, and on the door were poorly painted numbers. I looked back at my phone. 2760. It was the address. I got out, holding the food in my hand as I walked up to the RV. Getting closer, it was a bit unsettling to look at. It was overgrown and old, which was strange considering it was a mobile home meant to be moving around. I gave it a knock and waited. This was a rare cash order, which made more sense once I saw the place, but it definitely didn't make me feel good having to stand here. As I looked around, an eerie feeling loomed over me. This place was surrounded by the woods with no lights anywhere past the RV. It was complete darkness. I heard something from inside, and I prepared for them to open the door, but then a voice to my right startled me. I looked over and saw a man smiling at me, standing by the corner of the RV. He asked if I had his order, and I nodded, apologizing, and walking it over to him. I handed it off and said it's total. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, then smiled again and said he just needed to grab the rest. He turned and walked back around the RV while I stayed where I was. This whole interaction, in writing, doesn't seem as off as it was in person, but I can tell you there was something very wrong about this guy. It was just something about the way he acted and said everything that gave me chills. I waited for a minute or so before getting more nervous and looking around the corner to see where he went. In the distance, I saw a figure standing by what looked like the dark outline of a shed. They were not walking. They were just standing there. As the fear grew inside me, my head jolted around, hearing the door to the RV opening. A different man looked out at me, and just as I started to greet him, he slammed the door shut. My heartbeat now intensifying. I looked back out at the man who was by the shed. He was now walking back toward the RV, but had something else in his hands. In the moment, I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but it was either a long bat or a rifle. I ran back to the car, getting in and turning it on with shaky hands. As I put it in reverse, the man came around the side of the mobile home and stood calmly in the darkness as I drove off. I don't know what happened there, but I wasn't exactly keen on finding out. I went straight home afterward and debated calling 911, but was caught up on the fact that I didn't actually know what was going on. In the end, I made the regretful decision not to notify the police. Whatever happened that night will remain as just the strange encounter it was, with no answers to the true nature of it. I was driving through my city delivering for Postmates way back in the day when it had basically just started. Every order was mostly inside the main city blocks, but I had just gotten an order from outside the main roads. I picked up the food and headed over, but the further out I got from the city, the more the roads became less populated, both of cars and of houses. Everything was replaced by the woods. I'd been out this way before, but only when leaving town. I didn't even know there were houses out here. I drove until the GPS told me to turn down a gravel road, which was almost unnoticeable. There were no lights aside from the dim ones coming from my old car as I made my way down this thin path through the woods. It was much longer than I expected, taking a whole minute to reach the house. To be honest, it was what I assumed it would look like due to its isolated location in the woods. It was aged and almost entirely made of wood, with vines growing up the outside of the house. There were a few lights on inside, shining through the windows, but if there hadn't been, then I probably would have thought twice about approaching it. I checked the back for everything, then went up to the front door. I pressed the doorbell, which didn't really work, so I had to knock as well. As soon as my hand hit the door, though, it creaked open cautiously. I opened it a little further and called out, "I have an order here from Postmates." A moment later, I called out again, "Anybody home?" There were no sounds coming from inside, but all of the lights I could see were on, and through the crack in the doorway, I could see a TV in the living room. It was playing but was muted. I don't know how else to really explain my thoughts, but the vibes were just off, and I knew something was wrong about this. I turned and went back to my car, getting in and starting to do a U-turn right away. I felt a problem. The steering was stiff, and my car was struggling to move through the gravel, feeling extremely bumped and jittery. I got out, and my face went cold when I saw that my front tire was flat. I then moved my eyes over to the other tires, and every one of them was flat as well. Not just a little deflated, but completely flattened. My stomach dropped instantly, knowing this was a purposeful act. In that moment, my mind was everywhere. What terrified me was that I didn't know whether someone put something on the path, or if someone had come up while I was at the house and done it behind my back. Either way, the only thing I knew was that someone was out here with me, way out in the woods in the middle of nowhere. I got back inside my car and locked the doors, trying to call 911, but had no connection. As I ran through my few options, I saw a light in the house flicker, and the front door opened wider, revealing a man in the doorway. Without any hesitation, he started walking quickly over to my car. I didn't second-guess myself this time, putting it in drive and forcing my car through the gravel. In the mirror, I saw the man stop and stare at my car. Once I was on the main road, I took it more carefully, driving slow to keep from damaging my car until I got enough signal to call 911. But what unfolded afterwards was equally as terrifying. That house was owned and lived in by a single mother with 2 kids, all of which said they were at the house sleeping in their rooms at the time I claimed this happened at. They never ordered anything or saw any man or even found anything missing in their home. I don't know if they were in on it somehow or if they were just as much a victim as I was. Why the man ordered food to the house and slashed my tires still doesn't make sense to me. Though the only thing I've thought of is that maybe he was planning to do something horrible to that family, and I was going to be set up somehow to take the fall for it due to my presence at the property at the exact time it would have been committed. It may be a stretch, but if that's true, then me getting away might have saved more lives than just my own.